like any others before or since. Designed by a butcher from Pontypridd and a German prisoner of war, they were the cars that Wales made and the cars that Wales forgot. Whatever happened to Gilburn? Today they sell cars here, but once they used to make them. Inside there are still a few reminders, and outside one or two clues. But mostly it's just memories. Memories of Giles and Bernard. Memories of Gilburn.
I'm Giles, and Bernard's Bernard Fries. Gil, Giles, Bernard.
In 1958, Britain got its first motorway, and most of the cars which drove along it were British. Firms like Austin, Morris and Wolseley were making cars. But so were ordinary people all over the country, creating one-offs which were called specials. In South Wales, two men were about to go a stage further. One was Giles Smith, a butcher's son from Church Village near Pontypridd. The other was Bernard Fries, a German who'd spent time as a prisoner of war in Kent. After he was released, Bernard decided to stay in Britain. He was helping a friend build a one-off car.
When I finished the thing, Giles Smith passed my house and the car was standing outside. I'd only just sort of completed it.
Just stopped in the vehicle I was driving, walked over and said, "Oh, good afternoon, what are you doing here?"
He was very interested in doing the same thing, and I said, well, don't throw away your money.
I can see him on the side of the road now. Well, in the gateway, you know.
Unless you use modern components, it is senseless to try and turn an old junk heap into a sports car. And he said, well, why not have a go? And I told him, well, look, I just haven't got the time. And the cost of, you know, on the one-off would be horrendous. And he said, no, I mean, sort of, as a business.
I either phoned him or spoke to him, and he came up, and I told him what I wanted to do.
He kept on about it. We met a few more times, and I think I spent at least 3-4 months trying to talk him out of it.
Giles eventually won Bernard round. Church Village was about to get its very own car factory. They moved into a makeshift garage above the Smith family butcher's shop. Visitors had to walk through a slaughterhouse to see them.
Well, the first thing we did was build a garage over the pigsties at the back of the house, in Pentoyne House in Church Village. So, in fact, we had to build the building to make a car in.
Peter Cottrell was a semi-professional driver, 9 years older than Giles and Bernard. They called him in to help test the car they were building.
Well, I knew Giles slightly before, and his wife at that time asked me if I would call out to Giles' premises to look at a car. Well, it was then originally a body they were trying to make for starting a car, and she was very insistent I come out and look at it.
Peter found Giles and Bernard hard at work. They were using parts borrowed from other cars to make their own prototype. The bodywork was glass-reinforced plastic, or fiberglass. It was cheap, easy to mold into shape, and it never rusts. After a few months, the car was ready.
When I saw the prototype shell coming out, which incidentally I stayed at the workshop that night over the old slaughterhouse till gone, well, I think about 1 o'clock in the morning, when the first shell was pulled out of the mould. When I saw it, I thought, well, this is no special, this is going to be a production car. And my interest really grew from there.
When it was time to test drive the prototype, Bernard, Giles and Peter took it to Llandau Airfield in the Vale of Glamorgan. Howard Biley was the local correspondent for Autocar magazine. He came to have a look and brought a few friends.
Well, the prototype test at Llandau, the body was held onto the chassis by G-clamps. Wasn't screwed on. And the amazing part of it was that the car, although we were driving it to its capabilities, the body hadn't hardly moved. And that was very impressive. That showed there was no flexing of the chassis going to the body.
The car they tested that day became the Gilburn Grand Tourer, the GT. It wasn't cheap. A new GT could cost up to £950. For that money, you could have bought 2 Minis.
This vehicle here, of course, is how it all began. This is the GT, the first Gilbern. And of course, one has to look at that vehicle and compare it against the products of the time. If one looked at the mass production opposition, much of it, of course, was pretty angular, pretty boring. But this vehicle looks almost in some ways like a mini Ferrari. The shape of the grille there is resonant of the Ferrari sports cars of the 50s and 60s, and the bonnet line and the air intake on the top. Very rare. You wouldn't see that in many of the cars of the time.
The whole idea behind it was that the young couple getting married had a sports car. If they had a little family, they could not get the children in the back of the car. Now, the Gilburn GT gives sports car performance because it was lighter than the current MGB, and yet was able to seat 2 children in comfort and 2 adults of quite reasonable size. I mean, you really could sit 6-footers in the front and 2 normal people in the back.
This is what Autocar wrote when they reviewed the Gilburn in 1961. They said the Gilburn's appearance is pleasing and its performance capabilities are high. Most of its mechanical components are used also in well-known production cars. And the ability on occasions to carry 4 people adds to the appeal of this sporting little car.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown.
I'm Maureen Jockle and I drive a 1964 Gilburn GT 1800.
Downtown, just listen to the music.
We've had it about 3 years altogether, only drivable for about a year. My husband bought it in bits, carrier bag full of bits, and he's restored it, and I'm the driver of it now.
Troubles, forget all your cares, so go downtown. Things will be great when you're downtown. No finer place for sure. Downtown, everything's waiting for you.
Yes, it's a very nice car for a lady to drive. It's a smooth car to drive. It's not a hard car. It's not heavy. It's very easy to park, and still has enough room in the boot for some shopping. Not quite big enough for the golf clubs.
To go to where they never close. Downtown.
Oh, lots of reaction, especially more from the men than the ladies. They are often looking in their mirrors as they drive past, turning round even to look at it.
The light's so much brighter there. You can forget all your troubles, forget all your cares, so go downtown.
Lots of people try to see the badge because they're not sure what it is. And sometimes when they see it, they're still not sure.
You're gonna be all right now.
It's unique. You don't see many of them around. It's a lovely line, and I think most people are quite envious of me driving this, especially the men.
The GT sold well, and before long it was time to move. Giles and Bernard went looking for a site to build a factory. They found it less than a mile away at the old Llantwit Vardra colliery.
Away from the house, away from the connections with the butchering, you know. In more ways than one, family connections as well, you see. Once I was down in Llantwit, that was it. I was definitely out.
We hardly knew ourselves. We had a proper spray shop. We even had a little office, believe it or not.
Most of the Gilburns made in those early years were kit cars. They were supplied almost complete, but with some work for the owner to do. In the 1960s, everyone who bought a finished new car had to pay a special purchase tax of around a quarter of the total price. But kit cars were exempt, so buying a Gilburn meant doing a bit of work yourself.
They had to put the engine in, connect the gearbox, put the back axle in, connect the gearbox to the back axle, the prop shaft, wire it. The harness was there, but they had to actually wire it to the lights and what have you, and put the wheels on.
The whole concept, in the way that we started, the company started the business, I mean, it was as a kit car manufacturer. But going that little bit further, which meant that by just staying inside the law, you could have a car which was in every way the equal of a fully manufactured car.
As far as work was concerned, well, there were only 4 or 5 of us, so it's obvious we were all jack of all trades, master of none in a sense. We all had to muck in together.
And mucking in together meant Giles and Bernard didn't just make the cars, they had to sell them too, to women as well as men.
It is rarely that one person buys a car. It is usually husband and wife, or young man and girlfriend, and she's got a great influence, giving demonstrations, which I, frequently did. My tactics would be, you go, take them both for a run very sedately, keep the revs down nicely. You come back, and she would be very pleased. It isn't like she thought at all. It wasn't one of these roaring sports cars and this sort of thing. And you then give her the trim samples and the color chart, and you say to her husband, now, let's go for another quick run. And then you put your foot down and try to soil his underwear. And at the end of that, you got both happy.
In 1966, Giles and Bernard launched a new car.
What can I say? It's a fantastic looking car. I think the Genie was a different concept altogether. Sharp lines, cleanliness, good lines, actual fact. All in all, a nice car, proportionately well put together.
But I think these cars are the ones that Gilbern are known for. And really, in many ways, they look the piece. That car is well put together, the styling is nice, and of course the thing it really has is that it's a genuine 4-seater. In many ways, you could say it was a plastic Capri.
Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear words they're saying, only the echoes of my mind.
My name is Cledwyn Lewis, and I drive a 1969 Gilburn Genie.
I can't see the faces.
We actually visited the Gilburn factory in about '66, thinking possibly we'd buy a Gilburn. But when I saw the Genie, I thought it was absolutely magnificent.
Going well, the weather suits my clothes.
I certainly knew of no other car with electric windows at that time.
Sailing on summer breeze.
Over the years, we had thought of getting a Gilburn, But with a growing family, it was totally impractical. It wasn't until 1989 that we actually bought this Genie. It took a long time.
I'm going where the sun keeps shining through the pouring rain.
It's very pleasant to drive, although very different from modern cars. In fact, entirely different from modern cars, and you don't realize until you've driven something like this the progress which has been made in motor manufacturing.
Skipping over the ocean like a stone. Everybody's talking at me.
With the Genie, Gilbern had arrived. Giles and Bernard were now making cars that were fully built in the factory. There was no need for the customers to do any work themselves. They became members of the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. It was showtime. Now, at last, Giles and Bernard were allowed to have a stand at the motor show in Earl's Court.
We used to go to the motor show every year, and you'd sort of look at cars like a Ferrari and what have you, and say, well, maybe one day we'll be here, not sort of really believing it. And then the day came when we were at Earl's Court with our stand directly opposite Ferraris. So there were no competition to us.
The achievement of having the first Welsh-built car on the stand at Earl's Court, the first ever Welsh car. We introduced the Dragon to Earl's Court, then put it that way.
Up to then, people, a lot of people wouldn't take you serious, but once you became a bona fide manufacturer exhibiting Earl's Court, you know, you were there and people would accept you. It was at Earl's Court and the show where I saw the first girl in the miniskirt.
3 years later, there was another Gilbern on the market, the Invader. But by now, Giles and Bernard had nothing to do with the company they had created. Gilbern had been sold on.
I spent 11 years of very, very hard work. No social life to speak of. All my time went into that. Strains and stresses, you know, with my family. And I really just felt enough was enough.
I think it was 11, 12 years, and we weren't anywhere. Well, we obviously had a good name, the car. The car itself had a very good name. We were ticking over, but we weren't making any big strides as far as profit was concerned, like so many small businesses. And we felt that having insufficient capital, we couldn't take the next step up the rung and increase the output, you see.
I won't say that I felt bitter, but nevertheless, I felt it very difficult to detach myself from it. And I couldn't even bear to look at the factory when I drove past in the car.
Ironically, it's the Invaders, which were produced after Giles and Bernard had sold the company, which most people associate with the Gilbern name.
My name's Simon Porter. I own a 1970 Gilbern Invader Mark I. When I first saw the car, it was parked outside the front of somebody's house. It had looked as though it had been stood there for possibly 3 or 4 years. The tyres were flat, the wheels were very corroded, the bonnet was seized shut.
You sexy thing, you.
The gentleman who owned it had owned the vehicle for 18 years and had come to a stage where it was either needed restoring or scrapping. It took me 18 months of hard work to restore, which involved cutting part of this body off and through the club buying a front end and glass fibring the whole section on.
How did you know I needed you?
It's quite an amusing story wherever you go to, any shows, there's always somebody who comes up and says, I used to work at the factory. The amount of people who worked in the factory must be unbelievable, because I must have spoken to a good 100, 150 people at shows who said, I used to work there, or my brother-in-law used to work there. I think that most of Manfred Varder used to work at the factory at one time or another.
Where you from? You sexy thing, you.
It is part of the national heritage. It was made in Wales. It has been sold all around the world. So it's a good export as far as I'm concerned. So it should be given a bit of limelight.
The whole point of slowly and carefully handcrafting a car is not to make it different, but to make it better. To give it as great a combination of good quality and good manners as one could reasonably expect.
In the 70s, getting a good review for your new car was as important as it is in the 90s, and there was nothing better than a good review on television.
Luxury is the first impression. Cloth-faced seats, a good shape, what seems like acres of leather. It turns out to be expanded vinyl, but it's good and it will look good for some time to come. Is there room for the feet of the passengers? Electric windows, what every luxury car should have. Steering is very positive.
This Ford engine was never meant for a sports car either, though it produces enough urge to reach 70 1/4 miles from standstill. Twitch the wheel and the car answers faithfully. There is no hesitation at all, no suggestion of losing grip or running wide. Its handling peculiarities could get a relatively unskilled driver into serious difficulties. A practiced sporting driver could exploit these characteristics, but he could get better results in any of several more competent and less pretentious cars.
Throughout the early 70s, Gilburn lurched on, passing from owner to owner. 3 versions of the Invader were made, but often the company came close to collapse.
Gilbern find themselves now £90,000 in debt, and the creditors have appointed a receiver. Attempts are being made to pump some money into the industry to give it some life. Whatever the problem is, it doesn't seem to be the car.
I won't hide the fact that I was very disappointed in the way things carried on from there on. So the company just became something like assembling a football to be kicked around and played with.
One change of ownership after another meant that there really wasn't a focus. The people who bought the car company had bought it and then wondered, what shall we do with it? And then found that running a car company wasn't as easy, wasn't as clever as they thought it was.
I'll keep working my way back to you.
In 1973, the purchase tax on new cars was finally abolished. In its place came VAT. There was now no real reason for people to buy a kit car. Things got worse with the fuel crisis. Gilburn was back in the news.
So after a couple of anxious months, it looks as though this prestigious £3,000 Welsh sports car could be back on the road to financial well-being. And these carcasses, which have been sitting around here like parched camel bones throughout the summer, could become gleaming new Gilburns.
But those gleaming new Gilburns were never made. The end finally came in 1974. There are still arguments about who bought the very last Gilburn. Some of them disappeared in lieu of wages, which had been unpaid for weeks. The shells from the rest remained on the site for years.
I think it deserved a lot more than what the outcome was. Mind, this was shared by a lot of other motor manufacturers. When we say, a lot of people say about how Gilbern went. Well, you could say, how did Hillman go? How did Morris go? How did Austin go? How did Sunbeam go? How did Talbot go? The motor industry is littered with failed car companies. Must be the biggest graveyard of the world.
It is quite astonishing, actually, for a small company, a kit car company initially, coming out from not a very, very visually friendly factory. After all, it was on the site of an old pit, that you made about 1,200 cars through the entire life, and nearly half are left. Now, that's the sort of batting rate, if you like, that a company like Rolls-Royce or indeed Aston Martin would be proud about.
Well, I think the Welsh people should be very proud of it. From my point of view, I would rather have this than any other car to drive. For me, it's a priceless car.
The disappointing and the heartbreaking point is this: if I go to Cardiff and I'm speaking to someone, and or I may not say Cardiff, but up the valleys, if you go around, and someone might say, "Oh, this is Giles Smith from Gilbern," and the bloke will just say, "Who the hell are Gilburn?"
It was far more difficult to sell a car in Wales than it was elsewhere. You know, it was incredible, but I felt very often people always only just made up the road, so it can't be an awful lot of good.
Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and I think it looks good. It still looks good. And fortunately, there are a lot of people like me who still think it looks good.
Having done it, then you look back and think about it, and I suppose 99 out of 100 people look at a motor car and they just don't appreciate what's gone into it.
It always brings a smile to my face when I drive it. It stands out in the crowd, and you get admiration and people asking, what is that car? We've never seen one before. What is it? Where can we buy one? And it's a great pleasure to own one and drive one.
We were making something from scratch, so to speak, on a shoestring. How many people could make a motor car on a shoestring, if you see what I mean? Build the factory to build the car.
Against all the odds, two men with no experience in the motor industry did exactly that. They may have been built on a shoestring, but more than a quarter of a century after the last Gilburn rolled out of the factory, there are still hundreds of them on the roads today, and they were all made in Wales. Remember that next time somebody says to you, "Whatever happened to Gilburn?"